Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Pearson Edexcel GCSE English Language Revision PowerPoint. We've called this Final Push, and this is part 2. So if you're watching this one and you haven't yet seen part 1, then please check it out. That's all referring to paper 1 with lots of focus on language and structure as well as planning your writing. This one is focused on paper 2, so we'll be talking about how to answer the larger paper of the two exams. This one will be on the 7th of June, which is the Friday. Obviously this is 2019, and if you're watching this after this date, the dates will be slightly different for the exams, but it'll be only maybe a few days difference. Okay, so let's get straight into it. So the paper 2 is the non-fiction and transactional writing paper. So this is all about things that have happened or are based on things that have happened in real life. Paper 2 is worth 60% of your total GCSE grade, with paper 1 being worth 40%. So let's take a look at the timings. This is just to make sure that you actually use your timing appropriately and make sure that you don't waste any of your time. Paper 2 is 2 hours and 5 minutes. Now that's without exam access arrangements. So if you have exam access arrangements which also include extra time, you'll need to factor that into your timings as well. This is based on somebody without exam access arrangements. So obviously the first thing you need to do is spend time reading the texts that you're given and looking at the questions. You need to remember that text A is for questions 1, 2 and 3, with question 3 being the language and structure question. And questions 4, 5 and 6 are about text B, with question 6 being the evaluation question. Questions 7A and 7B are on both texts. So you need to make sure that you read text 1 with reference to language and structure, and text 2 after looking at question 6, so you can see what the focus of the question is. Once you've done that, as you're looking through answers for the evaluation question, just see if anything stands out as being similar or different to text 1. So if there's anything that they share, perhaps the narrative voice, perhaps the theme or topic that they're discussing, anything that stands out as being similar or different. So you want to spend about 60 minutes actually answering the questions, and then you want to look at the writing section and spend about 10 minutes planning the writing section and about 35 minutes doing the writing. These are all guidelines and aren't exclusive, and you can do them in any order. You could do the writing section first and then the reading, but I would recommend that you do the reading section first, because the reading section will actually help you with the writing section. So as I said, the first thing you need to do is to read the text and make sure that you actually read it carefully. In paper 2 you've been given 2 texts. One is a 20th century text, which is 1900s onwards, and 21st century text, which is the year 2000 onwards. Make sure you read the italic text at the top of the extract, because this will give you the purpose and the form of the text, and that will help you to determine who the intended audience are. It'll also help you work out how the language will actually affect the reader. For example, if it's a piece of travel writing, it's likely the intended audience will be somebody who's interested in travel. Or if the travel writing is done by a celebrity, then it could be the intended audience is not just somebody who's interested in travel writing, but also somebody who's interested in the person doing the travelling themselves. Once you understand who the intended audience is, it really will help you to work out how language will affect the reader, because you have to remember you are not the intended reader. When the writer was writing the text, he didn't think that Joey in 2019 would actually be analysing the text. In the non-fiction section, these texts have been produced for magazines or websites or newspapers, or actually just general textbooks. So that's something worth remembering. So you want to spend about 10 minutes reading and annotating the text. So look at language and structural features in text 1. Make sure that you highlight and underline anything that you find, as well as writing on the extract themselves in the margins of the thing that you found. So if you found a power of 3, make sure you make a note of it, because when you look at it later you might forget why you underlined it. So yeah, text 1 you want to look for language and structure, and on text 2 you want to look for a specific focus in order to evaluate a text. Okay, so read the questions just to find out what you need to look for specifically, and then go into the text and have a look what you should be looking for. Read the text again just to have a look overall at main ideas and themes, and just to get the understanding that you need of the text as a whole. So you can see there, when you're writing about language and structure, you should probably spend more than 15 minutes on your answer, to be honest. You probably want to actually spend about 20 to 25 minutes on the question. Excuse me. Read the whole text carefully. Identify all of those things that you need to look for that you've identified within the questions. Don't forget, you are the reader, so think about how it makes you feel. You're not the intended reader, but you are still a reader. So questions 1, 2, 4 and 5 are all read and retrieve answers. Now if you've seen part 1, you'll see what I mean by explicit and implicit information, and some of my examples that I use here are similar. So it's not terrible if you haven't seen part 1, you should be able to watch this one without part 1, but if you need any further clarification then certainly watch part 1 as well. So you're being assessed on your ability to actually find information within the text. So it'll ask you a specific question, ask you to identify a specific thing, and you should be able to identify it easily within the text. It could be that the text is explicit in what it's saying, so it's very clear, it's there, it's written. Or it could be that it's implicit, which means that they've implied something and you have to read between the lines to actually understand what that means. So this is the example that I used in paper 1, and you can excuse me, you can see how, if the question said how had the character been reared, the explicit answer is I had been reared in a workhouse. If you look at the next part where it says where had he been drafted, it would be had been drafted at the age of 10. So they are explicit answers. Implicit is where you see it says I had been reared in a workhouse, and it suggests that he had a hard childhood. And where it says he'd been drafted at the age of 10, it suggests that he had no choice, he had to start work at a young age. So you're looking at not just explicit information but also implicit information. Make sure you read the questions carefully, because if it tells you which area of the text to look at, then you should focus your answer on those lines. Don't get it from another section of the text, because it will automatically make your answer wrong. So make sure you check your question, see if it says between the lines 9 and 22 or whatever. Make sure you get your answer from that section. So question 3 is language and structure. This is worth 15 marks. There are 3 large reading questions on paper 2. And trying to get as much as you can out of these questions will certainly go a good way towards you achieving a very good mark in the exam. One thing you must remember is that you have to talk about both language and structure. If you don't, then your marks are only limited to a small amount. In paper 2, they're limited to 6 marks. Out of 15, it'd be a shame if you wrote quite a lot about language, but then ended up actually being restricted to 6 marks because you hadn't mentioned structure. The question is absolutely identical on every single paper. It will always say, how has the writer used language and structure to interest and engage the reader? So you need to consider what the impact on the reader is. Who is the reader intended to be? Has it been written for a specific audience? As I said before with the travel writing, if you like reading about other countries and other places, you may read some travel writing. If you're going on holiday to a specific area, you may read some travel writing about that area to give you an idea of what it has to offer. If the person doing the travelling is a celebrity of some kind, David Beckham, Michael Palin, other people like Carl Pilkington, when they do the travelling, it could be that you're more interested in the celebrity than the place they are visiting. Perhaps they use humour, or they use sarcasm, or perhaps they're just very detailed in the way they describe the area. So think about the reader. Who is it supposed to be, and what are they going to get out of it? The writer has had that person in mind every time they've put pen to paper, so think of that. How is the writer making them feel? So if they've used humour, it's a good way of making people feel good, because laughter makes people feel good, also makes them in a good mood. If they're making them scared about a travel trip that they've been on, I mean, obviously there's so many non-fiction genres of texts available. There are more than just travel writing, but I'm just using travel writing as an example. If it's a place that has a deep history, perhaps the writer is making the reader feel like it's all very poignant and very sad, talking about the history of the place and things that have happened there. How is the writer keeping them interested in the topic? Are they perhaps giving a little bit of foreshadowing at the beginning of the text to tell you about something that may be happening later? Are they just giving you lots of detail and you want to find out more? Are they only hinting at things and not giving you the full information so that you have to read on more? And how are they addressed? Is it in first person or third? So if you think about, if it's written in the first person, then the writer is hoping that the reader will go with them on their journey, travel with them, experience things at the same time as they experience them. If it's in the third person, it could be that they're just giving very general information. So this leads back to what the actual intended purpose of the text is. So if it's very disjointed, if it's very informative, it doesn't have any emotion at all, then it's probably just giving information. But if there's a lot of emotion, then they're trying to make the reader feel something. In the third person, you get a broader sense of what's going on as well. You can see everything at the same time. In the first person, it's all very much as the writer sees it. So as the writer is looking around and seeing something for the first time, you as the reader are also seeing it for the first time. Is the writer being positive or negative about the topic? So do they enjoy what they're talking about? If it's travel writing again, have they enjoyed their trip? How do you know that? How can you tell that they've enjoyed it? Is the language very positive? Or are they being quite negative, saying perhaps if it's a review and they're talking about the food not being very pleasant, they obviously are trying to stop you from going to the place. So think about that as you're looking at your non-fiction texts. So yeah, just to finish off, is the writer trying to use humour? Are they trying to use sympathy? Who is the writer and what are they like? How can you tell? So if it's a well-known writer, if it's somebody that you know, such as Carl Pilkington or David Beckham, and it's somebody that you know about, you may know them as a person from their media coverage. So it might be easy to make a lot of assumptions about the writer and what their interests are. But if it's somebody who is unknown, you might be asked to identify what the writer is like as a person, if they've enjoyed their trip, or if they're positive people in general. And you can tell this by the language that they use. So what kind of words do they use within their text? And how does that make you feel as a reader? But also, how would it make the intended reader feel? In terms of structure, how has the piece been laid out? So has it used short sentences? Short sentences are used to make things go very quickly, to add anticipation or excitement to a text. It could be that it's all a bit hectic and there's a lot going on and it's all happening very quickly, so they use short sentences for that. Does it have longer, more complex sentences? It could be that it's giving you a lot of description about the thing that they're writing about. It could be that the writer themselves are bored or sleepy. It could be that they're worried about something, Or it could just be that the intended audience read long, complex sentences normally. In non-fiction texts, we have to make a lot of assumptions about the reader. Non-fiction texts have a more specific audience in their mind when they're writing a text. So if a writer has written an article that's going to be in the Times or the Independent, generally speaking, the language is more complex, the sentences are longer and more complex, the paragraphs are more longer and more complex. And that is because the reader is assumed to be more intelligent, to be more interested, and to have less of a hectic lifestyle where they can have the time to sit and read these things. Short sentences could be more directed towards tabloid newspapers such as The Sun or the Daily Mirror or the Mail. And that's because they intend their audience to be slightly less intelligent. Obviously, this isn't always the case, but these are assumptions that we can make by the use of the sentences and about the intended reader. Is the piece written in the past? Is it written in the present? Or is it considering a future? So it could be that if it's in something like National Geographic and it's talking about global warming or climate change, there could be some language in there that are considering what the future may hold. And because it's talking in the future tense, that is considered to be a structural feature as well as a language feature. It could be that it's written in the past. So again, if it's travel writing, it could be somebody who's reflecting on a journey they've been on, or it could be an article written about somebody that has passed away, or it could be written about a topic that's already happened. So structurally, you could talk about past, present, or future, but also that will help you in the language section as well. Does it start at the beginning of an event or reflect on one? If it starts at the beginning of the event, then there might be a bit of build-up before the actual event happens, and the writer could be using short sentences to show excitement, to try and engage the reader, to get them excited of what's going to happen in the future. If it's reflecting on an event that's already happened, it could be a sad event and the tone is very poignant, or it could just be that the writer is just remembering something that happened. A top tip, always refer to the reader or the audience in your answer. The whole assessment, the thing you are being assessed on, is how it affects the reader. So how does the reader feel about the text? Remember that language on structure on paper 2 is different because it's non-fiction. Okay, so it's something that is based on truth. Generally, travel writing is something that's called literary non-fiction, where they're talking about something that's based on truth, but they have added literary devices to make it more exciting and more interesting to the reader. A storytelling element to the story to make it more fun. If you remember when you've been telling a friend a story about something that happened over the weekend, you may actually add extra details, or you might hold your listener's attention by holding back some information until later. Or you could add a bit of foreshadowing to try and tease them into what happens later. Sometimes travel writing and other non-fiction texts use these devices to try and interest and engage the reader to make them want to continue reading the text. Consider rhetorical devices. So if you think about the mnemonic persuade, those of you that aren't familiar with persuade, P is power of 3, E is emotive language, R are rhetorical questions, S is say again, which is the same as repetition, U is undermining opposing views, which is where somebody who is against somebody else will refer to their thoughts and feelings and then make them sound ridiculous. Consider watching the Parliament speakers and how Conservative and Labour sit opposite each other, and how Labour will say that Conservatives are doing something and then Conservatives will respond to that. So it's about undermining what they say. So if they say something, you're saying it's rubbish, basically. So that's you. A is anecdote, which is a short story which adds a personal feel to a story. If you think about a hospital closure, you may want to talk about how a family member had been treated there. You're adding a personal note to it to make it more poignant, more persuasive. Direct address, where they use you and say you a lot within the text, and exaggeration, where they're making something sound better or worse than what it is. So you may want to just rewind that little bit of this video and just rewatch that and make a note of persuade and what each of those things mean. And obviously, if you're still unsure, you can actually just send me a comment and I'll answer your question for you. So rhetorical devices are trying to change the opinion of the reader. They're trying to persuade you to do something. It's usually obvious in things like speeches, either given by a member of parliament or somebody from an activist point of view trying to convince others to feel the same as they do. Advertisements use a lot of persuasive techniques as they're trying to persuade you to buy a product, or as they're trying to persuade you to donate to charity and things like that. Obviously, political articles or articles that are trying to elicit some opinion of some kind, you will be able to spot a lot of these rhetorical devices, and they're very easy things to spot once you know what they are. So there are other language features that you may be familiar with from school, such as alliteration, onomatopoeia, hyperbole, obviously is the same as exaggeration. It could be there's examples of allusion, A-L-L-U-S-I-O-N. Allusion is where they're referring to something else that we are familiar with. So, for example, if it was a film review, they may refer to another film to show a similarity. So lots and lots of different language features that you should be able to spot. Okay, so let's take a look at the example at the top of this slide here. So this is an extract from Who to Be a Paperboy. It's a 21st century text, and if we look at the bits that are underlined, you'll see that we have it's cold, it's dark, and you've got to bolt your breakfast. So the first part of that is a power of 3 example. Power of 3 is used to exaggerate or highlight a point for emphasis. Also, our brains, there's something about the brain of a human that likes things in threes. Whenever you describe anything, you tend to do it in a 3 sort of a 3 structure. The second part is bolt your breakfast. This is alliteration with the B and B in bolt and breakfast. This creates humour and is also emphasising how unappealing paper rounds are to young people. Obviously, alliteration is something you'll be familiar with from school. That's nothing new there. The last part says, so who would be bothered with a paper round? Obviously, this is a rhetorical question. Now, rhetorical questions are really easy to identify in a text that's asking you to look for language and structure because it has question marks, so it's always really helpful. The rhetorical question obviously is there to make the reader think. It's not to be answered, so it's just making the reader sort of question it themselves. This example also has the word bothered in, which is a colloquialism. It's everyday language, so it's trying to appeal to a younger audience as well. Okay. Remember though, it's more important to comment on the effect that a device has rather than remembering the name of the device you found. It's much better if you say the writer has used the word than if you try and say the writer has used a noun when actually they used a verb. So just be aware of that. So question 3 continued. We can also spot any examples of fact, opinion and expert advice or evidence. In non-fiction texts, obviously they're based on truth, but more often than not a writer will come across as it's their own opinion, and there's nothing wrong with that. We can make our viewpoint very clear by saying it's our opinion, but sometimes a writer will use evidence from an expert to back up their opinion so that the reader will believe what they say all the more. So if we have a quick look at this example, but the bottom line is that most kids can no longer be bothered to get out of bed for 20 quid. So there you are, there's a viewpoint from the writer. If we go to the next stage, it says new research from Cartoon Network shows your average kid is raking in £770 a year, of which only £32 comes from paper rounds. So Cartoon Network, they're being referred to as an expert in talking about children and what they like to get up to and stuff. And then this writer has also used facts and statistics by using money to talk about what people earn in a year at a young age and how much of that was actually paper rounds. So just it's a way of backing up what he's saying and making their point more believable by having the expert opinion in there. So that was question 3. Now we move on to question 6, which is the evaluate question. The evaluate question also shows on paper 1, but it's question 4 on paper 1. So very much similar kind of thing that you're going to be doing for this question. It will ask you to look for a specific effect. So it will say the writer has attempted to achieve, and then it will say something, and then you've basically got to be quite critical and decide whether or not the writer has actually achieved what they've set out to achieve. So consider spite. So when you're looking at what they've tried to achieve, you're looking at the setting that they've done it in. Does it reflect on what it is they're trying to do? So if they're trying to create a sense of danger, is the setting a dangerous setting? Or is it out in the open with no dangers at all? Think about the people that are involved. Again, if it's about an element of danger, what are the people like around them? Are they people who would add to the danger? Are they people that are there to reassure the main character? Perhaps safety people to try and actually reassure the reader that the danger, although it's present, it's safe. Are there any incidents or events that happen in the extract that are linked to what the writer is trying to achieve? And what is the tone that they're trying to achieve? If you consider the tone, if it's trying to be funny but it's actually really depressing, then it's not going to be helping situation. It's not going to come across as a happy thing if it's being boring or morbid. So consider the tone that they're trying to use. Use references from the text to back up whatever point you're making. So you've got to prove to the examiner that you know what you're saying is right because you've got the evidence there in front of you. There's no point saying the writer has failed to achieve the effect of danger, because by saying they failed to do something, you're leaving yourself stuck with trying to find evidence to disprove something. Whereas if you agree that they've tried to do it and then look for the evidence, it'll be a bit easier. And don't forget to actually say at the beginning and at the end of your answer whether or not you think the writer has been successful. Think about the audience that the piece has been written for. So let's think about all these things now. If the piece is trying to reassure parents, then the intended audience are parents. And are the language choices appropriate for parents? Is the tone reassuring? Is it positive? How does that reassure the parents? And what about new parents? What about parents to be? Will it have the same effect on them? Parents generally is just a collective noun. It's just describing people who have children. But your grandparents are parents. They are parents to your parents. So consider that. Rather than having a broad term for the intended audience, perhaps it's a bit more specific depending on the message they're trying to send. And think about how the tone actually helps the writer to achieve their purpose. Perhaps it's less successful because the piece has a wider audience and doesn't have the same effect on unintended audiences. For example, if you, the reader, are analysing a piece of text and you are looking for elements of danger, but you don't notice any sense of danger, that doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't a sense of danger. It just means that you're not as affected by it as perhaps the intended audience would be. If it was talking about danger and talking about going to Australia in the outback and experiencing dangerous animals, if you were trained to look after those situations, to take people on hikes or safaris, then you would be used to having to deal with it. And although the danger is still there, you wouldn't be as affected by it. But somebody who's travelling to Australia and has never done it before, the danger would be more prevalent. So think about that. Think about who the intended audience is and how it affects them. Make sure you give your answer a summary at the end to say if the piece was successful overall. You want to start off with that, then you want to find as many things as you can to identify the writer has been successful, and then again say this has therefore made the writer's attempt successful. Okay, so question 7 is in two parts. We've got 7a and 7b. 7a is the similarities and 7b are your comparisons. And it's asking you to use both non-fiction texts this time. So the other questions in the exam have all been about text 1 or text 2, but now we're looking at both of them together. And there will be a shared theme in both texts. They've got something in common. Now the question might actually say that both texts have tried to do something, find the similarities. So avoid the thing that they've actually said, but you're looking in 7a for the similarities, and then in 7b you're looking for the differences. 7a is only worth 6 marks. You need to take an overview of both texts and make 3 or perhaps 4 points to back up your overview. So it could be similar in many different ways. It could be that the topic is the same. It could be their perspective or point of view about the topic is the same. They might both like the thing they're writing about or both dislike it. The language that they use, they could both be talking in everyday colloquial language, or they could both have a formal tone. Again, it could be a positive or negative tone that they're using, or it could just be the way that they're structured. So for example, if they're both pieces of travel writing, that is a similarity. On 7b, however, you're looking at a comparison. So you're asked to compare how the writers look at their ideas and perspectives about the shared topic. So it's worth 14 marks, and with 7a, the whole thing is worth 20 marks. And you're going to be required to compare the writer's ideas as well as the actual language that's used. So make sure you use examples from the text as evidence and make a detailed comparison. And the best way to get started is to highlight words in the question that tell you what they want you to look for, and then skim the extracts looking for evidence that's relevant to the question. So just skim read it and look at both texts. Make sure you do it in both, because if it's not balanced, then you'll lose marks. You want to make sure your comparison is equal, and the same with your similarities. If you say both texts have got something similar, you need to find the evidence from text 1 and text 2 to show that. Don't just say they're both similar. In text 1 it says this, because that's not showing the similarity with text 2. And the same is said for the comparison. Look at both texts, look at what's different. You can include anything that you've answered already in your exam. From question 3 with the language and structure, perhaps there's a similarity or a difference for you to use in 7b with the structure or language in the second piece. You could use your evaluation to see if text 2 has attempted to show a sense of danger. Perhaps text 1 has as well, so you can use that. It could be that one's really positive about the thing they're talking about, the other one's really negative. It could be one's very formal and very serious and very withdrawn and not very emotional, whereas the other one is more contemporary, up to date. The language is more everyday language, and it's more positive, it's more exciting, it's more interesting. So whatever you can find, this is where you get to write about both things, and you get to actually compare the text and see what is similar and or different. And when you write in your comparison answer, you need to come up with an overarching comment. So both writers experienced hardship, so almost as if you're rewriting the question's key words. Continuously compare both texts. Use comparative language, so similarly, likewise, in the same way, or you could say both texts have this, in contrast, or however, unlike text 1, on the other hand, compared to. Words like that demonstrate to your examiner that you are comparing. You can make direct comparisons as well as indirect comparisons. It could be things that are in black and white in the text, or it could be just an understanding you get from both of the writers. You could focus on one language feature from the first and compare it to the second one, perhaps saying how that affects the reader. You can discuss the tone, but make sure you're clear which text you're referring to in each of your comments, because if you say one text has got something and the other one hasn't, you want to make sure you don't get those the wrong way round. So that's all of the reading section over and done with. We're now going to move on to the writing section. Now the writing section, again, it's transactional writing, so it's writing real life things. You can be creative, but it has to be based on a real event. And you're going to get 2 questions. One question could be an article, the other one could be a letter, it could be a speech, it could be anything that is real life. It could be a piece of travel writing. It will probably link in some way to the reading section. So whatever the reading section was about, the writing section will have some link somewhere. It could be that the form is similar. So if you're reading a travel piece, it could be they're asking you to write a travel piece. So you can use that to help you. Or it could be that the topic is similar, so a memory of childhood or a political opinion. It could even be a controversial issue. Often they like to use controversial issues in transactional writing because young people feel quite agitated by events that are happening in the news or opinions that are upsetting to a lot of people. They tend to get you to talk about them, mainly because it gives you a lot to write about. So look at both questions, read them both and decide which one makes you feel the most comfortable, and that should be the one that you choose. So make sure you consider the language choices, vary them a little bit, use sophisticated language, perhaps use your inner posh voice is what one of my students says, as a way of trying to keep the language formal if you have to do a formal piece of writing. And just spend a little bit of time planning what you're actually going to write. It's easy to distinguish non-fiction and fiction because it's based on real events. So you need to consider what's the purpose of your writing. Are you trying to persuade somebody to do something? Perhaps you're trying to persuade the local council to not close a park. Or perhaps you're trying to persuade somebody to come on a trip with you. Perhaps you're just giving information, or perhaps you're offering people advice. When you're asked to write an article, a report, a letter, travel writing or section from a textbook, you need to know what features they actually have. So for an article, you can see on this example, you need a title. You do need an author, and it does actually have the author's name on this example on the bottom right hand side. I would suggest that you put the title and the author next to each other. You would use things like subtitles. On the question there will be bullet points. I would recommend that you use a bullet point for each subheading if possible. If there's 2 things in each bullet point, then you could break it into 2 different subheadings. You can use facts. If you know any, that's great, or if you're making them up, at least make them sound believable. Use statistics as well, and throw in some expert opinions that make your opinion sound more realistic, more valid. You can actually use the non-fiction text that you've just read. So if your non-fiction text is a piece of travel writing and somebody's been on a trip, and the other thing they're asking you to write is give advice to somebody who's going on a trip, you could perhaps direct your piece to the person you've read about. Use them as an expert opinion. You can use images as well, but do not spend a lot of time drawing an image. Just draw a box. Right within the box, insert image here. You can then underneath, you can put a caption describing what the image is. This will just add an extra element of structure to your writing. You want to engage your audience by using rhetorical questions and direct address. So if it's asking a controversial question, perhaps ask your audience the question. If you look at the example on the right hand side, it says, so why are they tipping their brim to this retro hit? That's a rhetorical question. It's not giving a reader an opportunity to write in with their answer. It's just making the reader think about the thing before they continue to read the rest of the article. Direct address makes the reader feel like they're being spoken to directly. It makes them feel like they're part of it, like their thoughts and opinions are worth listening to. In your own writing, try to avoid using I, because when you start writing I, it all comes from one perspective. If you want to include it as a final summary paragraph, that's absolutely fine, but try your best to show unbiased. You don't want to be biased in your opinion that you're writing about. You can try and write in the third person narrative, but that might be tricky too. So just try and balance it somewhere between the two. Make sure you include everything that's been put into the bullet points, because they are there to help you to make sure that you don't forget anything. So make sure you do include those. So that's an article. When you're planning your writing, you need to make sure you stay focused on what you're writing about. Don't go off topic. Consider the form that you're using. What features does it have? So a piece of travel writing will have some literary devices to make the story more interesting to its reader. It'll be in the first person. It's likely going to be in the past tense, and it will also have a title and an author. A review will have a title, it'll also have a rating. It'll all be personal opinion with lots of detail. If you're reviewing a movie, you don't want to give too much detail because you give the plot away. But if you're reviewing a restaurant, you want to give as much detail as possible, perhaps advising your readers what to eat and what to avoid. Rhetorical devices help to persuade someone to go or to watch what you're reviewing, or to go to the restaurant that you've been to. An article, as we've just said, has a title, an author, it could have subheadings, it may have images, captions, text boxes, facts, statistics, expert opinions, quotations. Just think of any article you've ever read, either on Facebook or if you've seen it in a newspaper whilst you're waiting in the doctor's surgery, in a magazine or anything. Just try and imagine what it looked like and what it needs. And consider the tone that you're going to use. It wouldn't be appropriate to use humour if you're writing a formal letter applying for a position. Okay, so just think about that as you're writing. If you're doing a review, however, it could be quite good to have a bit of humour in there because you are trying to entertain your reader. So think about that. So your transactional writing, plan your time. You've got about 45 minutes to answer the question, and you want to make sure that not only do you plan it, but that you write it properly and that you leave enough chance for yourself to check it and check you haven't missed anything. Make sure you read the questions carefully and decide which question to answer that you feel better about. Perhaps that you know the topic very in depth and you want to go in depth with it yourself. Annotate the question with form, purpose and audience so you know what you're writing, and just have a quick plan what you're going to write about, who is involved and where it happened, etc. Don't forget as well, in terms of structure, there are obvious structural features that will get you marks, but there are some that you might not realise, like the sentence lengths that you're using. You'll get more marks if you change the sentence length that you're using. If you have a paragraph and it's just one sentence, why have you done that? Have you done it on purpose, or is it just a mistake? Go back, check it, break it up into 2 or 3 sentences if you have to. If you're trying to get excitement into your reader, use shorter sentences. If you're trying a lot of description, then use longer sentences. Consider which order your paragraphs are going to go. If you're writing a travel piece, are you going to start with getting ready to leave your house, or start with your departure from the place you're writing about and then go back to the beginning? Perhaps you could start at the very end where you've just got back and then talk about your holiday in retrospect. Think about how your audience are going to react to the piece and how best to entertain them, assuming that the text you're writing has an entertaining purpose. And what is the purpose of your text? Are you trying to persuade somebody? Are you trying to give them information? Are you trying to entertain them? Or is it all of these things? So we've got some examples here of questions where it says write a guide about your local school and school area. For visiting exchange students. So your topic is school life. The implied audience are teenagers, but parents might also read it. And the purpose and form is to give information and explain. So you can use headings and subheadings. If you look at the bottom question, it says an article for a newspaper giving views about a proposal to raise the driving age to 21 years. So the format is an article, we can tell that. The implied audience are mainly adults, so it needs a formal style because it's an article in a newspaper. It would be unlikely that young people would read a newspaper, and that's why we are assuming the audience is adults. Obviously, we're not saying that young people don't read magazines or newspapers, but you're thinking about your intended implied audience. Also, the topic, it's about the driving age, it's about what the advantages and disadvantages would be. And the purpose is to argue or to perhaps persuade. If you look at the bullet points there as well, it tells you things that you can include, so make sure you do look at those. So always consider your audience. You'll know who your intended audience are, so you'll know because of the question, and you just need to decide, are your language choices appropriate, and how are you going to keep them engaged. Rhetorical questions will help, but don't make that the only language feature that you use. Everything you've identified in the reading section, you can use to your advantage in the writing section. You can use the same tone. You can get inspiration from the topic that they're writing about. Perhaps follow the format that they've used. Look at your analysis that you've done on their writing. What did they use? What can you use yourself? So don't forget to consider the ending. If you just stop writing, then that means you haven't planned it properly. So you need to make sure that you have an appropriate ending. If you keep an eye on the time and know that you've got 5 minutes left, perhaps just come to a natural conclusion and give yourself a minute or two to check your writing through. So to sum up, plan your conclusion before you start writing. Are you going to end on a vivid image? Are you going to end on a warning? Are you going to end on a happy note? Are you going to end on a call to action? So don't just sit there, get up, go out and make it happen. Refer back to your introduction, but don't repeat it. So think about how you started, and you can frame your writing by finishing in the same way. You could perhaps even end on a question, which leaves the reader thinking about what you've written about. And don't forget, one of the most important things that you have to do is to proofread your work. You might think you've finished, but have you actually missed anything? Does your writing make sense? Could you have broken it up a little with more paragraphs? Use a double forward slash in order to demonstrate to your examiner that a new paragraph can be entered into there. Did you remember to put your title and your author? Reading through your work may help you to recognise simple mistakes that could cost you a full grade. Now, in the writing section, you are marked in 2 different ways. You're marked for the content of your writing, as well as for the structure of your writing, including your sentences, but also your spelling, punctuation and grammar. You want to make sure that you do the best you can in your spelling. If there's a word you don't know how to spell, you could just have a go if you like, but if you're not sure, go back to a more simpler version. But do try and use quite sophisticated language, because the grade band will jump up an entire section if you use sophisticated posh voice language. That's how my students refer to it. So that's it. That's all you need for paper 2. If you haven't seen the PowerPoint presentation for paper 1, please do have a look, check it out, download it, or just watch it a few times, make some notes, pause it, go for a brew, come back. It's about an hour. This one's almost an hour. You could use this as an entire revision section. So if you just do this video a couple of times before your exam, the other video a couple of times before your exam, I guarantee that when you come to do your exam, something I've said will stick in your head, and hopefully you'll get the grade that you need. I wish you all the very best of luck. I'm sure you're going to absolutely smash it, and I hope if you're my students, I don't have to see you again. Because if I have to see you next year, you're just going to be so sad, because you're going to have to do most of this all over again. So yeah, enjoy it. Enjoy some time off for the rest of the week. Get some revision done, even if it's only an hour a day, and take care. Thanks for listening. Bye.